Thank you. You're very kind. Thank you very much. Thank you, Lloyd, for those kind comments, and preceded with a very good summary of why we're here. And this is the article that he wants us all to read. I would appreciate the people who operate this auditorium will try to reduce the lights coming in on the podium and put a little bit more light if possible on the people gathered here. Somebody around who can do that? Okay. All right. Let's go. Half of democracy is showing up. Showing up at rallies, meetings, gatherings like this, courtrooms, showing up at city council gatherings, showing up at neighborhood council gatherings. Back in 1775, in my home state of Connecticut, according to the primary materials in a book I read through once in a while about the American Revolution, several thousand people showed up in a field at Farmington, Connecticut, to protest the policies of King George III. At that time, I don't think Connecticut had more than 80,000 people. They came by foot, by horse, by wagon, several thousand. What do you think it would take today to get several thousand people at Farmington, Connecticut? The great labor leader, Eugene Debs, in the early part of the 20th century, took a train to Chicago to speak to people in Chicago. 200,000 people showed up in a field. There was no email, no internet. A lot of people didn't have electricity. How come they showed up years ago? Huge labor rallies. When's the last time you saw a huge labor rally addressed by the head of the union? When is it last time you saw large rallies of farmers, even those that are left? It's very difficult. We watch screens, television, computer, video, hour after hour, day after day, week after week. We're in virtual reality, not reality. How many of you here tonight, on reflection, could have easily brought 2 more people who you count as your relatives, friends, neighbors, or co-workers? How many? Why not? You think you're here for me? You think you're here for Nader-Gonzalez? You're here for you. You can tell these people, you come to the Benson High School auditorium to defend yourself, defend your future, defend your children's life possibilities, defend the preservation of the earth. But we look at screens, we isolate ourselves, or we use email, or we just don't like to try to persuade people to break their Tuesday evening routine. I remember when I started to take on the auto companies, I would hitchhike to Washington from Connecticut, partly to save money, and partly I liked the adventure. I always learned from people who picked me up. One guy laid bricks, another guy was a tree surgeon, had a monopoly audience. And I went to Washington, and one day a truck driver picked me up in Delaware, and he said to me, "Where are you going?" I said, "To Washington, D.C. He said, "Why?" I said, "Because I'm going to federally regulate the automobile industry." He gave me a funny look. I thought he was going to drop me off on the road. Was that a display of excessive pride? No. It was a reflection that I'd lost a lot of friends in high school and college, in cars that couldn't protect them in crashes, even 20 miles an hour, because there was no airbag, no seat belt, no padded dash panel, no steering column, collapsibility, no side impact, no stronger door latches, no head restraints, all the things we take for granted, which the engineers in Detroit knew how to do decades and decades and decades ago. In fact, the padded dash panel was prevalent on the ancient Roman chariots. How's that? They gave GM 2,000 years lead time. At that time, death on the highway was the first leading cause of death for people age 4 to 24. And I got to Washington, and people thought I was a CIA agent when they said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm pushing to regulate the auto companies." They thought that was a cover. Why am I telling you this story? Well, it ended up very nicely. The highway and auto safety laws were passed by Congress in 1966, signed by Lyndon Johnson, nice White House ceremony he invited me to, and irregularly enforced to save over 1 million lives, and a lot of lives overseas because the other foreign auto companies had to meet our standards, and millions of injuries prevented or reduced in severity. Now, did that take 1 million people dropping everything they're doing? No. It took about 10 people, some engineers, I organized, few key people in Congress, one of them being Senator Magnuson from Washington State, who's the chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee. What it took was the media performing its responsibility to cover this, General Motors hiring detectives to follow me and lure me into compromising positions with young women, and being caught in the Senate office building trailing me when I was slated to be a Senate witness. That happens to be a federal crime, to intimidate a witness slated for testimony for a Senate hearing. The press covered it, and when people found out that these cars could have saved their lives, that the engineers were prohibited from doing this, that these cars were built as psychosexual dreamboats that collapsed on the occupants, killed them even in a 15-mile collision if their head hit the cookie cutters on the dash panel, they really got upset. And there was a swell, there was a rumble out there. And the result was the fastest federal regulation of a major industry in American history. 6 months it took. Now, we went on to do this with the coal industry that was exposing coal miners to black lung disease and mine shaft accidents due to negligence. In 1900 to year 2000, over 450,000 coal miners gave their lives for their companies. That's more than all the Americans killed in World War II. That's just one industry. Then we went on to establish the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, opposed by all the corporate lobbies. We overcame them. And then the Product Safety Commission, air and water, pollution control laws, the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency. Why did Nixon sign these bills? And more. He disagreed with these bills. He was a right-wing Republican. He would sign one after the other with a flourishing language, declaring how important this legislation was. He signed them because he was afraid of the rumble of the people coming out of the 60s, when enough of them showed up to be counted. Passive civil disobedience, nonviolent, marching, picketing, sitting in, teaching. Shame on us. Shame on us today. And shame is a great motivator if you allow it to infiltrate your mind and your conscience. Shame on us for not showing up to defend our country from the most criminal regime in American history residing in the White House. From the most impeachable presidency in American history. A presidency that is impeachable for a criminal war of aggression against Iraq that was unconstitutional, violated federal law and international treaties. Impeachable because of systemic torture, violating the U.S. Army Field Manual, the Constitution, Geneva Conventions, to which we belong. Impeachable because he arrested thousands of Americans, put them in jail without even charging. No habeas corpus. Some of them had funny-sounding names. Those are the ones that usually get the brunt, don't they? But when they do get the brunt, don't think that people with non-funny-sounding names are not going to lose their freedom and their liberty. Spying on thousands of Americans in violation of the FISA Act without a judicial warrant. That's a 5-year jail term. That's a felony. Bush and Cheney did it again and again. This is not a Watergate single episode. This is not lying about sex under oath the way Clinton did. These impeachable offenses are continuing day in and day out. This violence in our name abroad, backing regimes like the Israeli military to oppress and destroy the Palestinian people with your tax dollars, against the opinion of the Israeli people. This is not the first time countries are run by minority hardliners. We're run by minority hardliners. In Washington today, 70% of the American people want out of Iraq. A majority of Jewish Americans and Arab Americans, again and again, want a two-state solution over there. 64% of the Israelis polled want negotiations with Hamas, according to the great Israeli newspaper that does these polls, Haaretz. 64%. Did you hear about it here? 64%. 28% opposed. And a lot of ex-generals spoke out in favor of that 64%. Hamas, which was started years ago with the substantial help of the Israeli and U.S. government to counteract the PLO. How many times has that happened? Showing up. We've got to talk to our neighbors and friends and multiply ourselves to show up, because the politicians look at the number of people who show up, and Nixon was so concerned with people showing up on the campuses, in the streets, in Washington. The last Republican president who feared liberals, the kind of liberals who settle for the least worst of the two parties, even though every 4 years both parties get worse because the liberals never put any demands on the least worst, like the anti-war movement and John Kerry in 2004, closing down. Showing up. The second attitude we've got to have. I mean, Lloyd pointed out some of the problems. We don't have to go through all the problems. You wouldn't be here if you weren't knowledgeable about them and sensitive to them. Is how do we motivate ourselves? How do we motivate ourselves to have a higher estimate of our own significance as citizens? To break our routines, to carve out some civic time from our personal time, to realize that personal freedom doesn't mean we live in a democracy. Dictators allow people to have personal freedom. Marry who they want, go down the road when they want, buy what they want, play bowling when they want, play cards when they want. That's not real freedom. That's important freedom for daily living, but the real freedom to shape the future of the country and the world is civic freedom. It's what Marcus Cicero said over 2,000 years ago when he defined freedom for all time, in my judgment. He said freedom is participation in power. So when politicians use that word freedom, as Reagan did, and as Bush 1 did, and as Clinton did, were they really meaning that they wanted to give you, the people, participation in power? Of course not. They were using it as a slogan, as a verbal massage to make us feel good, because they didn't want to use the word tyranny. They used the word freedom. Freedom is participation in power. Local government, state government, national government, the decision to go to war, not to go to war, the decision to clamp down on the silent violence that we too charitably call pollution that produces cancer, respiratory ailments, the decision as to whether whole counties in California are going to be sprayed in the coming weeks because of the moth problem, without having a referendum, without having public hearings about the exposure of people and infants to the spraying. Motivation. Look at our forebears. How would you like to have been an abolitionist against slavery in 1830 in Mississippi or Virginia? How would you like to have been leading the sit-down strikes against Ford and GM in the 1930s? You put your whole job on the line. There was no unemployment compensation. There weren't many jobs then. They had to feed their family. They put their lives on the line. How would you like to have been like them? Pretty tough. How about leading the drive for women's right to vote? When they'd go door to door and they'd have dirty water poured on their heads by people on the second floor, and they'd laugh and scoot them away, or they'd be arrested and dragged to prison in Washington, D.C. when they were picketing in front of the White House. What was their crime? That women wanted the right to vote? Who opposed them? Well, some men did, but it was the industrialists, because the women were leading the movement against child labor. They were leading the movement against a lot of the hard edges of the Industrial Revolution. They were the leaders of the consumer movement when it was launched in its modern form in 1900 because of food inflation. These companies didn't like women. Getting the vote was bad enough. They were being challenged without their having the vote. But they went through it. They didn't quit. They didn't make excuses for themselves. Those workers who formed the trade unions in the late 19th century, the farmer, populist, progressive movement against the big railroads and the banks that were stifling their right to live a decent life with high railroad freight rates and high interest rates. Imagine, put yourself in the shoes of those dirt poor farmers in East Texas, 1887, when it started. They signed up 200,000 of their fellow farmers in 6 months, $1 dues a year. That's $50 now, equivalent. And they were dirt poor, and they had no electricity, no motor vehicles. They had no telephones. They had no internet. They just had their head, their heart, and their feet, and they had a cause to take on the most powerful corporations in America. And it spread all over the country in the most fundamental reform movement. They didn't make excuses for themselves. They didn't say they were predisposed and preoccupied, the way the lawyers of America are doing now in letting this criminal regime escape on January 21, 2009, as fugitives from justice, without any sheriffs pursuing them, thanks to the Democratic Party. Second motivation, your children and grandchildren. What are you going to tell them? The country's crumbling. 80% of the people are falling behind economically. Single moms trying to raise their kids, job and a half, and no daycare unless they pay $500 or more a month. And they got to commute with $4 gasoline. And if they get sick, the price of medicine is out of sight, thanks to the drug companies who are making huge profits and are subsidized by you, the taxpayer. They're called tax credits. And the U.S. government gives them the result of discovered and tested drugs free to market without any price restraints, drugs that you paid for, like Taxol, the anti-cancer drug, $31 million of your money through the National Cancer Institute, and they gave the drug to Bristol Myers Squibb, who then was charging women with ovarian cancer $14,000 for 6 treatments. That's life for most people in this country. Difficult, congested traffic, running around, no time to think, no time to breathe, no time for their children. This is the richest country in the world, where the head of Walmart makes $12,000 an hour, 8 hours a day, and his workers are making $7, $8, $9, $10. In medieval Europe, there wasn't that kind of wealth gap. And it's worse. There are some CEOs are making $100,000 an hour. Just imagine. It's hard to sink in. There are some CEOs in this country who go to work on January 2, 9 a.m. By 9:10, they heed the call of nature, and they go to the men's room, and they finish their job, and they come back by 9:15. They've made more than their executive secretary will make in the entire year. This is the land of the free, the home of the brave. What gets people upset these days? Gender slurs, ethnic slurs, racial slurs. Not the conditions that those slurs reflect, like asbestos in the lungs of our inner city kids, high levels of asthma, high levels of lead from lead-based paint crumbling off crumbling tenement walls. Who marches for that? Who loses their job? But don't ever have a racial slur. Don't ever have an ethnic slur. You can lose your job. You want us to have Bush impeached? Here's how you get Bush impeached. Not for killing 1 million Iraqis, not for blowing apart a country that didn't threaten us, not for endangering our national security by becoming a recruiting ground over there for more and more fighters coming to challenge us. And that's what General Casey and other Bush generals have said. Our military presence is a recruiting ground. More and more young men who learn the art of sabotage and violence, pursuing terrorists by creating more terrorists. Even a dog wouldn't be that dumb. Here he is. 4,300 U.S. soldiers lost their lives, mostly low-income whites, Latinos, and African Americans. Jenna and Barbara listen to their father every week say, the war in Iraq is worth the sacrifice. What have they sacrificed? Have they joined the armed services? Have Cheney's children joined the armed services? Have members of Congress' children joined the armed services, except for the children of Senator Webb and Senator McCain? And we don't even make a demand that they do so. You want to get this country out of war? You just pass a simple law. Before Congress and the White House plunge us into war, legal or illegal, all able-bodied, military-aged children and grandchildren of all members of Congress, the President and the Vice President will be drafted into the armed services. So what are we going to tell our grandchildren and children when they look us in the eye at age 9, sitting on our knee? Where were you, Grandpa, Grandma, when this country was crumbling? Yeah, we got a lot of excuses. Well, we were watching television, updating our profile on Facebook. What's our excuse? There's no excuse here. Don't think that personal freedom is any more than a fraction of the definition of what a democracy can produce. You think we have any influence on foreign policy, the way we're operating, the level of passivity and withdrawal? Any influence on half of the federal government's operating expenditure going to the military budget? There's no more Soviet Union. The military budget is really Lockheed Martin's budget, Grumman's budget, General Dynamics' budget. More and more gigantic weapon systems. We got enough weapons now to blow the earth up 300 times and make the rubble bounce. It's still growing. It's still expanding. And then we say, why isn't there enough money to repair our bridges, our streets, create modern public transit systems, make our schools and clinics and libraries whole again? Why isn't there enough money to upgrade our sewage treatment systems ecologically, or to clean our drinking water systems? So many of these drinking water systems are violating the 1974 drinking law, safety law that we got through. Lead, arsenic, residues of heavy metals. Now we hear there are medicines, residue of medicines and the drinking water? Ah, but we're building another submarine that can blow up 200 cities. This is Sparta. This isn't democratic Athens. And we let it happen. We, the people, let the corporations, run our country into the ground. Look what these corporations do. They have no sense of patriotism. They have no allegiance to our country. These are the big corporations we hear and read about, buy products from, General Motors and Exxon and Pfizer and Citibank and so on. And they rose to profit on the backs of American workers. And when they got in trouble, they went to Washington to get bailed out by American taxpayers. And when they get in trouble overseas, they get rescued by American Marines. And what's their debt of gratitude to America? They basically say to America, we're out of here with your jobs and your industry to communist and fascist dictators who can put their workers in their place at 50 cents an hour in dangerous working conditions, and then ship the products back here, contaminated farm-bred fish from China, defective tires from China. We're re-importing all the pollution that these dictatorships allow to occur because they don't really have pollution control laws. Is that the way they're treating our workers and our taxpayers? There is no allegiance to any country or community by these corporations, and we let them get away with it. And we let them use our tax dollars to build these football stadiums and these sports arenas while the schools, clinics, and libraries in the same city are crumbling for lack of money for repair. And we let them get away with it. Comes down to our own self-respect as citizens. Are we ever good at making excuses for avoiding our civic duties? We let politicians flatter us, flummox us, and fool us. They flatter us into inactivity and supine admiration for their empty rhetoric, when back in Washington, their record is opposite to their rhetoric. Look at Clinton, Obama, McCain. McCain doesn't really like the idea that wrongfully injured Americans should have their full day in court under the tort law system. He wants tort reform. Imagine using the word reform to indicate taking people's rights away at their massively most intense moment of weakness, when they've been rendered paraplegics, quadriplegics by defective products, automobiles, and other defective products. Clinton, she's never seen a weapons system she doesn't like. After all, she's a woman. She's got to be tough. She's got to appear macho. She's got to say, if Iran attacks Israel, she'll obliterate Iran. That's what she said. And there are 75 million people in Iran. They're civilians. And Iran has never attacked anyone in 250 years. Iran is the country that's been attacked by the U.S. through Saddam Hussein, has had its prime minister overthrown by the U.S. in 1953, that is targeted for invasion by the criminal regime in the White House. No wonder they're getting scared and they're making it like they're doing nuclear weapon research, and they're years away from that. And what if they did have a nuclear weapon? What would they do with it? Israel has 250 of them. We have thousands of them. Are they going to commit suicide? They want to defend themselves, and we've targeted them as the axis of evil, along with Iraq and North Korea, and we've blown Iraq apart. I wonder why the Iranians are scared. This is insane, what's going on. There's no other word for it. People act this way individually, they'd be committed. But politicians and corporations get away with collective insanity. And Obama, here he is, back in Illinois, before he's a U.S. Senator, openly supporting Palestinian rights. Friend with Professor Khalidi, who's now at Columbia University. Everybody who knew him those days You know, he was quite outspoken before he became a politician. Now he doesn't dare say anything about the suffering Palestinians. After he made a statement like that over a year ago, oh boy, he was taken to the woodshed by the AIPAC people, the Israeli military government lobby support in the U.S. And they don't even represent a majority of Jewish opinion. The American Jewish Committee, which really likes AIPAC, had a poll the other day, and more Jewish Americans said they wanted a two-state solution than said no. And there are other polls that had them up close to 68%. They don't even represent Jewish American opinion, but they have huge influence in Washington and in Congress. And Barack Obama, he tells us he's from the third world, he's lived in Indonesia, his father comes from Kenya, he's not going to be parochial, and he can't stand up for the people who are in the largest prison in the world, Gaza, 147 square miles with 1.5 million people being blockaded, embargoed, medicine, fuel, electricity, food. For what? For resisting a little bit? Far more missiles have been fired more accurately into Gaza by the Israeli military, objected to by some ex-military people in Israel, very, very courageously. Then these crude garage-built rockets, half of whom fall in Gaza, and the other half fall with a thud. Casualties have been committed on both sides. You know what the ratio is? Civilian casualties, 400 to 1 in the last year. 400 civilian casualties, deaths and injuries on the Palestinian side, to 1 on the Israeli. So who is the occupier? Who is the occupied? Who's doing the embargo? Who's keeping people in Gaza from even being able to do kidney dialysis? They can't even get medical equipment. The UN is objecting to this. They can't get their aid in. And Obama won't stand up for these people? You think he will if he becomes president? Don't bet on it. Cowardliness in a politician is like a contagious virus. Doesn't go away. It stays. So what are we left with here? Well, back to Eugene Debs. At the end of his career, a reporter asked him, Mr. Debs, what is your greatest regret? And Mr. Debs said, my greatest regret is that the American people, under the Constitution, can have almost anything they want, but they don't seem to want anything at all. Fast forward, 1945, United States, the #1 military and economic power in the world after World War II. Western Europe, rubble, destroyed cities, disconsolate people, millions have died, starvation is looming. And here's what they did. They demanded and got full health insurance for everyone. They demanded and got laws that facilitated forming trade unions to collectively bargain against large corporations. They demanded and got 4 to 6 weeks paid vacation, paid maternity leave, paid family sick leave, sometimes up to a year in the countries like the Netherlands. They demanded and got decent public transit and the rebuilding of parks and government support for the arts. They demanded and got daycare. By law, 62 years later, in the United States of America, land of the free, home of the brave, we have none of these by law. That's what Eugene Debs meant when he said the American people can have almost anything they want, but they don't seem to want much of anything at all. So don't let politicians inflate your head with the phrase that the United States is the greatest country in the world, because the corporations have made sure that it is not the greatest country in the world in infant mortality, in reduction of hunger, in the reduction of poverty, in paying a living wage, which the Europeans have. It is not the greatest country in the world in allowing a one bread earner per family to have a middle-class standard of living. Two now can't have a middle-class standard of living for the majority of the people in that two-income family category. They're in debt, they're in debt, they're in debt. What's the difference between us and the Europeans? They were coming out of the rubble and they desperately wanted a decent life, and they defined it in the way I've just given you, the examples, including the living wage. 1 out of every 3 full-time workers in this country doesn't have a living wage. What's a living wage? Well, it's not $6.50 an hour, it's not $7 an hour, it's not $9 an hour without health insurance. It's Walmart wages. We have great entertainment. We're #1 in the world in entertainment. #1 in the world in sports. #1 in the world in arms exports, often to dictators that use them on their own people, if not against our soldiers. We're #1 in the world in piling up incredible riches for the top 1/10 of 1% of the people. We're #1 in the world in deferring the necessities of the people. We're #1 in the world in deferred maintenance for our public works. Let's get rid of this false pride. That's how they manipulate us. They talk about the flag. There's the flag. When you look at that flag, what do you think of? What do you think of? You think of military victories. You think of soldiers carrying it. You think maybe the Pledge of Allegiance. But what are the last words of the Pledge of Allegiance that these politicians ignore? It's with liberty and justice for all. Not liberty and justice for some, not liberty and justice for most, liberty and justice for all. But we don't grow up looking at that flag representing with liberty and justice for all. Heaven forbid that that would be a discussion in what's left of our civics classes in our schools. The Nader-Gonzalez campaign is one that is authentic. It reflects accomplishments on behalf of the people. For 40 years, Matt Gonzalez is a 42-year-old civil rights lawyer in San Francisco. He was president of the San Francisco City Council after being elected to the City Council as an underdog, and he almost was elected mayor as an underdog. He's now a civil rights lawyer. You're going to hear a lot more from him in the coming years, which is one of the purposes of these presidential campaigns, to bring younger people into political activity who stand for the people, not grovel for the corporation. Now look what happens when enough people show up. 30, 40 years ago, who would have dreamed that Russians would be here and we'd be over in Russia supervising the dismantling of nuclear warheads? It's happening. Who would have dreamed some 40 years ago when I started going after the tobacco companies because because people smoked on airlines and buses and trains. I didn't particularly enjoy that. And I didn't like children and little infants having to breathe that stuff in. And so we, against the opposition to the tobacco industry, we got separation. Some of you may remember separation of planes, smoking, non-smoking, and then we got no smoking on all planes later. Who would have dreamed the trial lawyers, after losing one case after another against the tobacco industry, would finally, with state attorney generals, get them to pay $250 billion in compensation for the state's health care costs due to the devastation of tobacco. Our country has a lot of examples like that. We don't see them on TV enough. We don't hear them on radio. We have been lobotomized from history. We have been made to forget the highest moments of our history, the moments of citizen valor, the moments of a few citizens being told it'll never happen, it's impossible, forget it, you can't fight City Hall, you can't take on these corporations, and these citizens say, watch us. Well, one reason, of course, we don't hear that, and a lot of people in the younger age group don't even know about it, is that we don't control what we own in this country. One of the systemic ways corporations control us is they make sure that they control the greatest wealth in our country that we own together as a commonwealth. We own 1/3 of America, the public lands, the timber, oil, gas companies control. We own the public airways over which radio and TV stations transmit their programs. The radio and TV stations control our public airways. We don't have our own radio and TV stations or networks because we don't grow up understanding what we own. And so we don't even know that they're controlling what we own. We're the landlords, the radio and TV stations are the tenants. They pay us no rent via the Federal Communications Commission. They've had it free since the 1927 Radio Act, our property. And they decide who says what and who doesn't on TV. And they give us 90% of the time entertainment and advertising. That's real exciting. If we controlled what we own, tonight's gathering would be televised live all over the greater Portland or Oregonian area. But we don't control what we own. The same is true for all the research and development taxpayers pay that ends up in the hands of the drug companies, the containerization companies, the semiconductor companies, the aerospace companies, the pharmaceutical companies, the biotech companies. You think they did that with their own money? They did that with the taxpayers' research and development. NASA, Department of Defense, National Institutes of Health, given to them free. They don't even have a taxpayer appreciation day, these corporations, to say thank you to us. But they put full-page ads about their great innovations as if they funded and developed them. Nonsense. It's propaganda. It's lies. There are a lot of ways they control us. They control every government agency and department in Washington. Department of Defense, Treasury, Agriculture, Interior, Food and Drug Administration, Auto Safety Agency, FAA. They've taken our government completely from us. That's why I'm standing here. For 20 years, we got things done in Washington on behalf of the people, their health, safety, economic well-being, Freedom of Information Act. And now it's not possible. The doors are shut, except for corporate lobbyists. 35,000 of them, 10,000 political action committees pumping money into these politicians' coffers, and they get their executives in high government positions. Now you wonder why the government doesn't address the necessities of the American people? Now you wonder why they don't use your tax dollar, honestly? Now you wonder why they use your tax dollar to plunder overseas and defend these corporate criminals? Now you wonder why they don't put prosecutorial budgets to the level needed to go after the corporate crime wave from Enron to Wall Street that has looted and drained trillions of dollars from your pensions, from your investments, from your savings, and all kinds of lost jobs? It's because we don't have a government. The corporations are now our government. And the corporations don't have a single vote, do they? They have power and they have money, but they don't have a vote. We're the only ones that have a vote. So why are they so powerful? Because the courts back in 1886 gave them all the constitutional rights we have. What an absurdity. An artificial entity called the corporation. We're not talking about the employees. The entity, Exxon, General Motors, again, has all the constitutional rights you and I have, except the Fifth Amendment. Therefore, given that they can concentrate power like no billionaire can over capital, labor, technology, pit governments against one another, pit states against one another to get more and more subsidies. Oh, where are you going to move your plant? Well, who's going to bid? Tennessee, Michigan, Oregon? We can't have any equal justice under the law between you and Exxon or you and General Motors. Look what these corporations are doing to us. It's called strategic planning. They're planning our political future, our labor future, our election future, our governmental future, our educational future, our communications future, our pharmaceutical future, our health future, our genetic future, and a good deal of our military and foreign policy future. And they're not human beings. They don't vote. They don't have children. They don't have grandparents. They don't have parents. They don't die in Iraq. And we don't learn about this in the schools. We don't learn about it in the colleges. We don't even learn about it in the law schools. That's the level of propaganda and the corporatist grip in our minds. And partly they succeed because we grow up corporate. I grew up corporate. You grew up corporate. You want me to test you? What do you think right now when I use the following words? Crime, violence, regulation, and welfare. Crime, violence, regulation, and welfare. What are the images? Street crime, wars, rapes, poor waiting for their checks, welfare checks, government regulation. To some degree, that's obviously true. But to a far greater degree, there is corporate crime that steals far more than larcenies or burglaries. Corporate violence that destroys more lives than street crime by far. Corporate regulation of your lives. They're closing the courtroom door when you have a dispute with a company, like a credit card company or a bank. They make you go to binding arbitration. They take away your rights of personal injury under tort law. The contracts you sign mean nothing to you except slavery. They're all fine print. You sign on a dotted line. Allstate doesn't have a different policy than State Farm. GM dealer doesn't have a different policy from Ford. And it's all one-sided. You didn't add a word. You're supposed to sign on a dotted line, shut up and obey. And so they take away all your rights in the fine print. Student loan racket is an example of that. Insurance policies, bank cards that you fill out to get a deposit. You ever read them? You go into a hotel, not responsible for this, not responsible for that. What are you responsible for? Ripping us off? HMOs, the same thing. You're on a stretcher going into a hospital, for heaven's sake. They want you to sign your rights away. The other day, a woman with leukemia was referred by her physician in Texas to MD Anderson Cancer Institute, one of the best in the country. She's sitting there in the office filling out the forms to be admitted, serious case, and the clerk says, we can't admit you unless you give us a certified check for $110,000. Where else in the Western world do you die because you can't afford health care? 18,000 people in this country die because they can't afford health care, according to the Institute of Medicine and National Academy of Sciences, pretty prestigious group. 16,000 people die from homicide. Now watch the comparisons in terms of preventable deaths that are attributed to corporate misdeeds and negligence. 58,000 people, according to OSHA, die every year in this country from occupational disease and trauma. 65,000 from air pollution, according to EPA. Almost 100,000 from medical negligence in hospitals. Need we go on to show what corporate violence is like and how preventable it is? Corporate regulation of our lives through government, using government to regulate us, is far greater than government regulation of our lives. Government is their agent to regulate us, but they regulate us directly. They get into our minds. Imagine hearing those words, crime, violence, regulation, welfare, and we don't even think corporate because we grow up corporate. They color the way we look at products like automobiles so we don't demand better safety engineering. Till the mid-60s, we were really being sold a pile of junk. Gas-guzzling monsters where you get killed in 10-mile-an-hour collisions, huge repair bills, polluting cars, the engineers knowing how to remedy this in Detroit, not being allowed to? We never had a frame of reference as to what cars could be like until the mid-'60s when we blew it open. And now over 1 million people, lives have been saved and tens of millions of injuries reduced, as I mentioned. It's just thinking independently. Instead of growing up corporate, we grow up civic, like some of our greatest relatives, uncle, aunt, wife, boy, independent thinker, skeptical, doesn't take propaganda and swallow it, wants to get the facts directly. How long will this continue? Until we stop thinking it takes too much effort to get too little change. That's the Achilles heel of the citizenry. I gave you some examples of the tobacco and nuclear warhead dismantling. I gave you some examples of the work we've done, regulating these industries, making them behave better before they counterattacked and took over Washington. But ask yourself this. You do things every day in your life that are far more difficult, far more painful, far more time-consuming than what I'm going to propose. You have to raise children. You have to rescue children from the streets or bad friends. You have to deal with accidents and sickness and grandparents who are ill, and there isn't enough home health care. This isn't Western Europe. Many of you have to work 2 jobs to make ends meet, and then you can't do that, and you're behind on your bills. People do a lot more difficult things than spending organized time in citizen and political action. First thing I ask you to do is to see that this Nader-Gonzalez campaign gets on the Oregon ballot, and Oregon has become a quasi-fascistic state when it comes to independent and third-party candidacies. So there are sign-up sheets up there where you can take away information, and we'll get back to you. One of 3 ways we have to go to get on the ballot: a convention, or signatures, thousands and thousands of them, or a small party. But your Secretary of State, who's in charge of exclusion of competition to the 2 parties and knocked us off the ballot, by changing the rules in 2004, after we'd complied with the rules we thought were the rules, is full of mischief. His name is Bradbury. He's a Democrat. He's elected. Someday, people like Bradbury would be prosecuted and put in jail for denying people their constitutional rights to be candidates on the ballot in all kinds of ways. Jim Crow against minority voter rights, we thought we dealt with in the South and elsewhere. There are Jim Crow-type laws preserving the 2-party elected dictatorship against competition from third parties. By saying to the voters who want different kind of candidates, we're not going to let you vote for these candidates because we're going to keep them off the ballot because we've written the laws and we've got the partisan judges and we've got the partisan Secretary of States. Can you imagine what this does to any sense that we're a democratic society? You remember when the Soviet Union would proudly announce, the Kremlin, after the election, 97% of the Soviet people voted, and we would all laugh? Don't you know why we laugh? Because there's only one candidate on each ballot line. Welcome to America. 90% of the House of Representative district, there's only really one candidate, the incumbent. They carve up the districts, the Democrat Republicans, they can't even stand to compete with one another. I mean, they're getting to look like one another. I can see a case of mistaken identity and why they don't think it makes that much difference. I think 60% of the state legislators in Massachusetts have no opposing party opponent in the election. You just walk in. Maybe it's about 35% here. That's not democracy. Democracy involves an election, which involves a contest, which has at least two. It's a coronation. You see anybody marching on this? We've got to cultivate a sense of civic indignation. We can know all these things, but if we don't have fire in our belly, if we don't look back at what our forebears suffered to give us what we have in this country that we're lunching off of, if we don't have a sense of what we're going to say to our descendants, if we don't have a sense of shame and self-respect, no matter how much we know, how much information about injustice there is, how many solutions that are on the shelf, very practical, can be put into effect, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. So we need to develop the language of civic indignation, not flying off the handle and losing control of yourself. What the psychologists now have daintily called emotional intelligence, to go with your rational intelligence. Now I keep saying you, but it really isn't so much you, because it's the people out there who have given up on themselves. You've probably been involved in a lot of activity. But people do rationalize their own futility repeatedly. They have all kinds of excuses why they don't show up, why they can't fight City Hall, why they can't challenge this, why they can't build that for a better society. And they get themselves in their personal lives and try to make it through life, little recreation, work, vacation, try to pay the bills, just stay out of the public arena. That's not what a functioning democracy is all about. We have so many solutions to energy, to housing, to public transit, to pollution control, converting our society to all kinds of benign solar energy, getting rid of subsidized corn ethanol that is increasing food prices. That was a huge boondoggle. But we have. People have a sense of fair play. It doesn't matter whether they're Republicans or Democrats. You hear Obama say again and again, we are one people, we are one nation, we must be united. I say, against what? For what? We must be united to reassert the sovereignty of the people over their country and their future against these giant corporations who are destroying our democracy. If you look at our website, votenader.org, I hope you remember it, votenader.org, you'll see daily what we're doing, where we're going, what we're proposing. We have one page as a line down the middle, McCain, Obama, Clinton, corporate candidates, Nader-Gonzalez, what's on the table for us, off the table for them. Reversing direction in the Middle East, single-payer health insurance, a unique type of obvious tax system where you first tax the things we like the least or dislike the most. Before we tax human labor and necessities of life as we do now, we should tax security speculation. $500 trillion of Wall Street security speculation, which would produce huge revenues to reduce the federal income tax load on working families. We should tax gambling. We should tax the addictive industries. We should tax pollution, carbon tax. We should tax the things we like the least and dislike the most. We believe in opening up the presidential debates so that more voices can be heard. A majority of polls wanted me on the presidential debates in 2000, 2004. We should have an aggressive crackdown on corporate crime, fraud, and abuse. The other candidates don't even talk about it, even though the business press reports it day after day. We should initiate immediate impeachment proceedings to impeach Bush Cheney, convict him, and send him going. We should say no to nuclear power and yes to solar energy. Cut the huge, wasteful military budget. Obama, Clinton, and McCain want to increase it, expand it, devour the federal budget, deprive people of the necessities of life that a government should be able to address, like clean drinking water and clean air. Now, I'll be back for a Q&A, but I do want you, if you can, to get your friends and neighbors, even if they don't want to contribute or vote to Nader-Gonzalez, just to sign in on our email list so they get a broader frame of reference for the presidential campaign, so they can better evaluate what's going on in the two parties, so they can see what the real redirections of the country are all about. Our positions are supported again and again by the majority of the American people. Isn't that ironic? But because we have an exclusionary political system, we're number 3 in the polls. And yet we represent a majority of the American people. 81% of the people polled say the country's going in the wrong directions. How many people believe that? Okay. 61% of the people think that the two major parties are failing. Gallup poll. Huh? Okay. 75% of the people think corporations have too much control over their lives. That's a Business Week poll. Okay? Okay, so why aren't we number 1? Because they've rigged the system, that's why. Because they keep us out of the debates, which is the only way to reach tens of millions of people, because they control this corporation that's called the Presidential Debate Commission, the Republican Democratic Party. They created it and controlled it 20 years ago. So let's go forward, and in the process, get more people to get on our email list, provoke discussion, pick up some of these buttons and pennants and bumper stickers. That stimulates discussion in the neighborhood when you have these kinds of buttons or bumper stickers, and start a lot of personal conversations. Word of mouth is the most powerful form of communication. It goes from relative to relative, friend to friend, neighbor to neighbor, worker to worker. It can go with lightning speed and considerable credibility. And don't think if it's not on the internet, on the news, that you can't spread the word. And on that point, I want to introduce a lawyer who's known to many of you. How many of you know Greg Kafuri? Okay, you know, he's a really great lawyer in Portland. For years, he has represented citizens who've been stomped on by government agencies or corporations, the kind of lawyer that is all too rare. Most lawyers represent commercial interests. He represents the interests of citizens who are trying to make a difference. He believes dissent is the mother of most assent. It must be protected and defended. And together with Lloyd and others, they are the only people in the United States of America, after 15 years of work, initiatives, lawsuits, discussion, have shut down a giant nuclear plant, the Trojan nuclear plant. So, let me introduce you to Greg Kafuri, and then I'll be back for discussion. And pursuing justice is fun, let's face it. It's the great work of human beings on earth. Look at all the things you like about your lives. At one time, people weren't allowed to live those kinds of lives. So let's not make justice and a clean politics and a presidential race to vote for people you believe in and not vote for the least worst. Let's not make it just a chore. It's a blessing. It's a joy. It's a spirit. Senator Daniel Webster once put it well, many, many years ago, when he said, justice is the great work of human beings on earth. And always remember that definition of freedom by Cicero. Freedom is participation in power. That's the one that grounds it in terms of our own shaping of our future. I always don't really like mottos much, but you know, Obama has this, yes, we can. Is that what he? I'd like our motto to be, we, the people, will decide. Thank you.
You've been listening to a lecture by consumer advocate, author, and presidential candidate Ralph Nader. In a moment, we'll return to the question and answer session from the program. Most recent among Ralph Nader's many books are Crashing the Party, Taking on the Corporate Government in an Age of Surrender, The 17 Traditions, The Good Fight, Declare Your Independence and Close the Democracy Gap, and, with Charles Derber, Corporation Nation: How Corporations Are Taking Over Our Lives and What We Can Do About It. Ralph Nader is also the subject of a recent documentary, An Unreasonable Man, now available on DVD. To find out more about Ralph Nader and his work, please visit the Ralph Nader website at www.nader.org. To find out more about the Ralph Nader-Matt Gonzalez presidential ticket, please visit their campaign website at www.votenader.org. And now we return to the question and answer session from the program. Ralph Nader spoke at the Benson High School Auditorium in Portland, Oregon on May 13, 2008.